Okay, so we're going to look at some models of aggression and violence now. We're going to look at a few of these. So we're going to look at firstly control theory, this idea that people can be chronically under or over controlled in their emotional expression. We'll then look at the social information processing model by Crick and Deutsch from the early to mid 1990s. And then we'll look at the general aggression model as well, a fairly straightforward model to end that should look quite familiar to you who've seen the social cognitive theory lectures as well. So let's start with control theory first. And as I've already said, this is really based around the idea that some people are either chronically under controlled in their emotional expression or chronically over controlled. Now, under control looks something like this. So someone will be very threat sensitive. So the slightest kind of suggestion of a threat in the environment or in that situation that they're in, they will act out. They'll have this kind of rush of emotional arousal and they'll act out as a result of that. They're very impulsive and under-inhibited. They won't be able to keep in that emotional arousal. They'll have to act it out in order to kind of alleviate that sense of emotion. And because of that, these individuals can be easily angered, easily irritated, and what this means is that they may present in clinical settings or in forensic settings as having high levels of trait anger. So this kind of long time kind of enduring anger issues. This is the kind of thing that you'll see in people who are chronically under controlled. When we think about over control, we're thinking about people who are maybe more goal sensitive rather than threat sensitive. So if someone has a particular goal in mind and they're trying to achieve that goal, then what they're doing is they're trying to bottle up all of their emotions so that they can reach whatever that goal situation is. Now, what that means is they'll be excessively inhibiting their emotions. So they will be rarely angered. They might have kind of a relatively stable outward sense of emotion. They'll look like they've got their kind of emotions intact and they can kind of control that in a way that is quite stable. That said, some of these individuals will still feel high levels of emotional arousal, but they will actively inhibit that almost to pass as if they are having everything under control. But what that means is that if people are constantly bottling up what they believe and what they feel, they're at an increased risk potentially of explosive violent acts when that emotion is kind of too much for them to keep in anymore. Well, when we think about over control, there's two different variants of this. The first one is referred to as the conforming type, and what this means is that people will typically be free from anxiety, free from kind of high levels of emotional arousal. They'll be quite sociable, they'll be able to conform to society, and they just won't acknowledge the fact that they experience high levels of emotional arousal. So these people will be able to pass quite well in society as being relatively normal in terms of their emotional regulation. The second variant, they will be inhibited. These are individuals who acknowledge that they have a lot of anger. They'll acknowledge that they have a lot of emotional arousal. They will feel emotion in a very kind of stark way, but they will actively engage in, firstly, rumination. They will think about their emotion a lot, but they will also suppress that. So they'll actively inhibit it, and they'll do that in various different ways. They will try and distract themselves, but they'll also avoid social situations that might elicit particular kind of emotional responses. Now, these individuals will typically present with poor levels of self-esteem and self-image, and they'll typically be quite socially isolated because they don't put themselves in a position where they will be feeling high levels of emotional arousal because of the fact that they experience such fluctuations in their mood, I suppose, and they don't want to have to consciously and effortfully have to inhibit that on a kind of everyday basis. So just to give you a couple of examples, this is Mark. He's somebody who has on average 4 incidents of verbal aggression per week on the ward that he's on, 8 counts of physical aggression. He reports that he attacks to protect himself, and he typically will attack first. Now this is kind of a typical case of under-controlled aggression, so under-controlled anger regulation, for example. He attacks first. He sees everyone in the environment as being threatening to him, so he'll preemptively attack. That's your kind of typical under-controlled personality. Ronnie, on the other hand, is somebody who has a history of violence. No real history of psychiatric disorders though. But what he's done is he is somebody who acknowledges that he experiences anger, but he keeps it all kind of bottled up. He doesn't express his anger. He doesn't express his emotion particularly well. What Ronnie would be is an inhibited type of the over-controlled personality. He's aware that he experiences this emotional arousal. Because he's aware of that and he actively keeps it in, we can make the assumption that he's got this inhibition type approach to his emotion. So he's the inhibited type over-controlled personality. Okay, moving on to the social information processing model. This is it looks quite a complex model, but actually it works in a fairly simplistic way, I think. So it's based around a few key assumptions. The first one is that children typically enter social situations with very limited knowledge, very limited capabilities of social interaction in general. And what happens is that as children and young people encounter different social interactions, different social situations, they'll pick up information and they'll store that in long-term memory. Now, behavioural responses to different scenarios that somebody's in will be based around a function of those memory stores, but also physiological arousal and cognitive arousal within a given situation. So if you think back to the Navajo model of anger, for example, a particular eliciting situation will have associated with it physiological arousal and also cognitive arousal in terms of what structures that activates, what schemas it activates, and that clearly has an impact on which behaviours are selected as the appropriate response in that situation. Now, as we grow older, these schemas become more ingrained and they have a much stronger impact on how we kind of make sense of different social interactions, but also how we select behavioural responses. So this model is based around 6 key stages. The first one's around the encoding of internal and external cues. So this is about understanding what's actually going on within that particular situation. And then understanding and analysing the internal and external cues. So for example, you'll first be recognising the behaviour of somebody else, and then the interpretation of that will be trying to look at why are they acting in a particular way. You're making some kind of attribution about their mindset in that situation. Once you've done that, you then start to clarify and select a goal. So bearing in mind how this person's behaving and why you believe they're behaving in that way, that will give you a selection of potential behavioural responses to that behaviour that person is exhibiting. What you need to do then is to construct and decide which is the most appropriate response for you to act out in that situation. And you can use various different inputs to make sense of that. It could be a combination of your cognitive structures in terms of your schemas. It could be thinking about what's worked for you in the past. It could be thinking about what's worked for you when you've been interacting with this particular person in the past. It also depends on what you want to get out of that situation. Do you want to fight in that situation, or do you want to flee? Do you want to kind of minimize the aggravation maybe in that particular situation? And then obviously you have the behavioural enactment and the kind of interpretation and the analysis around that. Was that an appropriate behaviour to enact in that situation? Has it enabled you to reach your goal state? So that really is the social information processing model. It looks something like this, but as you can see, if we start here, it very kind of clearly goes round in a cycle through from encoding to interpretation of cues, up to the clarification of goals and kind of the selection of a goal, making that decision about the response that you'll enact, and actually enacting that decision. Obviously, once you've done that, you will be evaluating what's happened in that situation. Has it enabled you to reach your goal? The important part of this theory, though, is in the center of the cycle here. This kind of database of stored memories and cognitions and emotions and social rules and the knowledge that you have about that. At every single level of this theory, what someone is trying to do is to reach a particular goal, but they're constantly going back to that memory store of what's happened in the past, what's their kind of schema about the most appropriate thing to do. So while this image looks perhaps a little bit complicated, if you just think about those 6 steps and how Each one flows from one to the next, but at each stage you're referring back to the memory store. You kind of understand this this model of aggression. Okay, we finally have the general aggression model, and this is a fairly straightforward model that just assumes that aggression and violence develops from an interaction between personal and environmental factors, that personality plays a role, that past experience plays a role, that certain environmental triggers play a role. And essentially it takes the view that aggression acts almost like a process. So the route from kind of an eliciting trigger of aggression, it kind of triggers this emotional and cognitive response. And again, if I just show you what this looks like, you have this initial triggering input. It might be a perceived slight, or it might be an actual confrontation with somebody. What that leads you to do is to process information in a particular way. So again, a triggering information directs your attention towards something. It helps you to think about the kind of motivation and the reasoning behind somebody else's acts. You have to process that. You have to come up with a behavioural response, maybe based around the idea of what's happened in the past and what's worked for you previously. Once you've processed that information, you then have a behavioural response, which may be appropriate or inappropriate in terms of aggression or non-aggression. Hopefully what you can see here is that this almost perfectly maps onto the social cognitive theory. So the triggering input triggers a particular schema that somebody might have, or a particular cognitive structure, which then feeds into your cognitive processing and how you can make sense of that situation, which then leads to a cognitive product, which is the behavioural response that you enact in the real world. Now, just a critique of these, it does suggest that anger and aggression and violence is more than just about frustration. There's kind of this link between frustration and aggression, which is quite straightforward, but it does kind of appreciate that there are other cognitive factors that might be associated with the enactment of aggressive behaviours. So that's very good. And these multifactorial models integrate various different areas of psychology. So they look at behavioural development, they look at moral development and social development, they look at cognitive processing. All of these different aspects come in. Physiological arousal in terms of the behavioural, the biological perspective also plays a key role in many of these theories. So that's all good stuff in terms of having integrated models. Now, what these models are, though, is very descriptive in nature. They lack kind of this systematic evidence in support of them, and it's quite difficult sometimes to suggest how the model or the theory as a whole could be tested. You can quite easily take individual parts of them and test them, but seeing whether or not a theory in its entirety can be tested in a kind of comprehensive way is often quite difficult. So that might be something to think about as you're reading around this topic, in that it's important to bring together and integrate various different areas of psychology, but it's quite difficult to then test the model as a whole thing.